Okay, so this is part of a larger project examining the role of the global tourist between 1870, just after the Suez Canal opened, and 1920, when cruise line operators began to change the experience of travel. Now, before Suez opened, there was a marked aspiration to extend tourism eastwards, and the best example of this can be seen with the development of Murray's handbooks. These were travel guides for Britain and Europe, and in 1859, Murray's Handbook for India was published. It was reviewed in the London Times in January of that year, and the reviewer wrote that a tour in India need scarcely occupy much more time than one in Russia. So the East, as represented by India, was just as close as exotic parts of Europe. And of course, tour operator Thomas Cook introduced his round the world tour in 1872. Now you can see from this detail of a P&O map from 1900 that the route eastwards, and this is where I bemoan the lack of a pointer, this route going eastwards through here was really amongst the most heavily travelled. Now obviously it took diplomats, civil servants, the military and mercantile travellers, but there was a marked increase in leisure tourists as well, and this influx of tourists didn't go unremarked. Mariah Murray Mitchell wrote in her 1876 memoir in India of tourists she met in Madras. So this new leisure tourist was dubbed the Globetrotter, and that term comes specifically out of India, China, and Japan in this period, and the East became something of a new grand tour. Now, although amateur travellers and their accounts have been deemed superficial, they brought something new to readers, and that was the global East. So notwithstanding its Orientalist view, and by this I mean 19th century Orientalism, not Saidian Orientalism, their ostensibly superficial gaze distinguished among Asian cultures, and this both challenged and confirmed public perceptions of the East. So for this paper, these are my dramatis personae, if you like. These are who you'll be hearing about. And it's got an image at the top of one traveller, Carew Davies Gilbert, in his jinrickshaw in Japan. And a lot of the images that I'll be using come from Carew Davies Gilbert's 1870s photo albums from his tour through India, China, and Japan. So this paper is going to explore 19th century tourist experience in Eastern food cultures and the role that culinary encounters, dining, and its modes and manners played in the quest for the authentic experience with local populations, which is a major theme in Globetrotter's accounts. Now, part of what imbued food as such a significant authentic experience was not simply that tourists consumed local food, but that they did so with local populations as part of social engagement. And these commensal meals were important in initiating social bonds, and they placed tourists in the role of active social agents who presented more nuanced experiences in their accounts. And just to give you an idea of what I mean by the superficiality that's ascribed to them, especially in terms of food culture, in 1870, Arthur Drummond Carlyle wrote that the life of an Englishman in Calcutta was not one of hardship, as those at home believed, but instead one of indulgence and ease. He said, where you could sit down to a luxurious tiffin in the midday interval. Now, tiffin was defined in Hobson Jobson, that was an 1886 glossary of Anglo-Indian colloquialisms, as a term used to denote luncheon. But tiffin appeared in late 19th century tourists' accounts to indicate any small, modest meal taken throughout the East. The cross-cultural usage of this term is apparent in Annie Russell Coates's account of an excursion in November 1885 to Kyoto in Japan. And she said, after tiffin, we visited the shogun's graves, which are called shogunzuka. Now, Frederick Thompson wrote of his 1891 visit to the Summer Palace in Canton that in one of the rooms I had my tiffin. So the application of an Anglo-Indian term across Eastern cultures would imply that tourists view them with little appreciation of differentiation. Yet Russell Coates' determination to identify the shogun's graves by their proper Japanese nomenclature indicated an awareness of the distinctive cultural differences between India, China, and Japan. Now, as demonstrated with the use of the word tiffin, India was undoubtedly familiar to British travellers. Indian material culture was already present in countless British homes due to the trade of the East India Company, and the Raj, the colonial government Britain put into place in the wake of the First War of Independence, or the Indian Mutiny of 1857, which is what I'm going to call it because that's what tourists called it, drew extensively from across Britain for its civil service. Now, culturally, the work of people like Rudyard Kipling made India an incredibly familiar place. So for tourists, India was the experience of the Raj. They used clubs and hotels as a means of socially aligning themselves with a colonial elite. And early Globetrotter Arthur Drummond Carlyle, who again travelled in 1870, presented his first commensal experience with the other outside of Calcutta, off the beaten track. And this is what he has to say about it. So he maintains this tension in his description between the familiar and the exotic, if you like. He's eating with an anglicised official of high caste whose wife is in Purdah. India was familiar yet exotic. It was adoptive of British customs and habits, and yet preserving its own culture, knowable and at the same time unknowable. And it's that unknowableness that's seen as a contributing factor to the Indian Mutiny. Now, it's clear in this passage that the commensal as a means of realising the authentic for Carlyle was not entirely successful. But what is important to know is that it's the other, it's the anglicised official, if you like, who exercises a degree of agency in maintaining separation from Carlyle. Carlyle is not permitted beyond the confines of the garden into the private personal interior. He's given a meal not of Indian food, but a collation, so a small meal in the European style. So here food's employed to maintain a social distance from the tourist. Now, what tourists thought of as authentic Indian food itself was questionable. For travellers, curry was synonymous with the culture of India, although the version consumed by Anglo-Indians and British visitors in the late 19th century was an amalgamation of Indian sauces with the addition of meat and vegetables served over rice. It was not representative of regional variations, nor was it really representative of Indian cookery. In Globetrotter's narratives, Anglo-Indian curry was consistently presented as emblematic of Indian food culture. But even this version of curry was problematic for some travellers. Walter Ryland rejected it during his 1881 trip through India. So throughout his travels in India, Ryland stayed in dak bungalows, and these are a legacy of the East India Company from the days before hotels. They were houses communally used by travellers, and they had a servant who was also a cook and house steward who was called a kansama, who was attached. They were resident. In the latter part of the 19th century, the dak bungalows were a cheaper alternative to hotels. And on arrival in Jaipur, Ryland and his travelling companions chose not to stay in a dak bungalow, but instead to stay in a newly opened hotel, the Kazari Hind, where he said he found a much better variety of food. Now, Ryland's great concern over the food provided the dak bungalow was that thick curry sauces potentially masked adulteration. And he wrote of it, he said, the cook might introduce into the mixture any kind of meat, either that of goats, pigs, fowls, or even of camels, for all you can tell. So food that lent itself to adulteration was not only inherently untrustworthy, it also reflected the untrustworthiness of the Indian cook and potentially all Indians. Now, Ryland's vulnerability to unscrupulous cooks wasn't confined to India, or indeed the East. Tourists making their way through Europe had similar complaints, and really this reflects their sensitivity to being othered and exploited by local populations. However, there's a political dimension to tourists' concerns in India, in part fueled by the legacy of the Indian Mutiny and by the changing political situation of the Raj. Ryland was travelling through India in 1881, 2 years before the legislation of the Ilbert Bill, which allowed Indian judges the right to pass sentence on Europeans. Now, a strand of the public discourse around the Ilbert Bill focused on the role of servants and how the bill would be the undoing of Anglo-Indian households, as their servants would have grown insolent and unmanageable. And the kansama, that was a position both in the dak bungalow but also within the Anglo-Indian household, fell into this position of potentially becoming insolent or unmanageable. Now, locals were equally aware of tourists' anxieties, and this 1901 advertisement, I apologise for the reproduction quality, but want to focus on that little highlighted bit. This is an advertisement for the Kazari Hind, where Ryland stayed, and it's making a point that the hotel is coming under new ownership. But it's also making the point that the old owner, who was the owner when Ryland was there in 1881, was a kansama, who, during the Indian Mutiny of 1857, stayed loyal to the British. So these points in the advertisement were to reassure tourists that here is a servant, who is a cook, who can be trusted. Now, this little booklet goes on for several pages, and there's another mention on another page. that talks about not only the former owner being loyal during the Indian Mutiny, but that he was a Muslim. So he's not bound by the same restrictions as Hindus in regard to food and its preparation. Now, household manuals for Anglo-Indian families suggested that a Muslim, or preferably a Christian, should fill the role of consommé. And tourists followed this advice as well. Frederick Thompson, who was travelling through India in 1891, engaged a servant that he described as a Eurasian named Pedro to look after his meals, which implied links with Portuguese Catholics and the Christian community in India. While there was a practical side to selecting a non-Hindu cook, the decision also reflected Western perceptions of Hindus as unclean and untrustworthy. Hindus were associated with the worst episodes of the Indian Mutiny, specifically Kanpur, where there was a large slaughter of a large number of women and children. And it's also at this point in the second half of the 19th century that the sites of the mutiny, again Kanpur and Lucknow, are amongst the most visited sites in India by tourists. They're a firm fixture on the beaten track. So the narrative of the mutiny and the role that was ascribed to Hindus was something that was in heavy circulation. In Thompson's representation, Hindus were contaminated, spiritually and physically, by their religious practice, going so far as to eat excrement and carrion. So the consumption of the inedible was used as part of a Western construction of a negative Hindu identity. And this, paired with the legacy of the Indian Mutiny, meant that tourists chose not to engage commensally with locals, but with the Society of the Raj instead. And Carlyle's commensal experience with a Hindu was both rare, but also heavily mediated on both sides by this spectre of the Indian Mutiny. Now, the inedible is a theme that persists. From India, travellers moved on to South China, and there are a lot of different regionalities to food encounters in China, but for the purposes of this paper, I'm focusing specifically on Hong Kong and Canton. Inedible encounters in China were mentioned in nearly every tourist's account. The first encounter with China for the majority of tourists that they had was Hong Kong. And of course, the island was a major British trading concession gained at the end of the First Opium War in 1842. And Hong Kong was the largest port for international shipping in China in the second half of the 19th century. And it's in Hong Kong in 1870 that Arthur Carlyle was a guest at a Chinese banquet, which was a meal that was for him emblematic of late 19th century Epicureanism, or this idea of the indulgence in the pleasures of the table, with its focus on gourmandizing. And this is a rather truncated description of all he had to eat. Historian Meibo Ching has written of the role that dining played in Canton between the Hong merchants of the East India Company in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And these meals were a mixture of high-status Chinese delicacies, including bird's nest soup, which you can see here, shark fin, which he does eat, and bêche de mer, which is sea cucumber. So Chinese merchants began to curtail these meals just before the onset of the First Opium War. But really, these meals are a template for the banquet that Carlyle enjoyed in a Hong Kong restaurant. And really, it shows how these meals were used to continue to build connections with Western visitors. Now, for Carlyle, this refined meal with the mercantile elite of Hong Kong took place within the spaces of a place that was largely British. But when he ventured beyond the confines of Hong Kong to Canton, he made a point of representing it as a predominantly Chinese space. And this is quite often how people viewed food culture in Canton. He marginalized the European population, so he made a point that a lot of the Europeans had decamped from Shamin Island, which was the center for trade, and had moved to Hong Kong. So it was really quite a small population as he represents it. That wasn't necessarily true, but that's the way that he chooses to show it, thus making his cultural encounters less diluted by Western presence. Food is central to his evocation of the Chinese city, and he begins his tour, interestingly enough, in the markets, focusing on the meat shops. And this is what he has to say about them. Food for Carlyle represented stark cultural difference. He paired the edible of duck, geese, and pork with the inedible meat of rats and dogs. For the Victorians, dogs in particular were either pets or strays. The sentimentality surrounding the Victorian pet placed it within the circle of friendship and family. Therefore, to eat a pet was an act of betrayal. Stray dogs were seen as disease-ridden, and to ingest them was to align with those who ate the indescribable, like Thompson's reference to Indians who ate carrion. However, Carlyle deliberately makes the point that it's the lower classes that consume the inedible, not the upper-class merchants that he dined with. Now, this division between rich and poor in the consumption of cat and dog flesh was something that was reiterated in tourists' accounts. In 1881, Walter Ryland wrote of what he described as the low-class butcher shops, where he said different sorts of joints of cats, dogs, and rats were sold. While 10 years later, in 1891, Frederick Thompson wrote of his visit to a shop that dealt exclusively in dogs, cats, and rats, which he said the lower classes eat with seeming relish. Yet, in an early guidebook, Walks in the City of Canton, that was published in 1875, John Henry Gray insisted that he witnessed middle-class Chinese merchants and craftsmen eating in a restaurant where, he said, no other food than that which consists of the flesh of dogs and cats is eaten. Now, in addition to Gray's assertion, Globetrotter Carew Davies Gilbert mentioned in a letter to his mother in 1878, and he said, "We went to a native restaurant and ate cat and dog. The latter was good, not so the former." By breaking food taboos and dining on what Westerners deemed an inedible but authentic representation of Chinese food, Davies Gilbert placed the tourist in an ambiguous role. What was repeated in published narratives reiterated ideas about the other and their differentiation through the food they consumed. However, Davies Gilbert provides a glimpse into the Western consumption of Eastern food that broke taboo. This undercuts much of the rhetoric about difference in tourist accounts. While they may have officially followed social dictates in expressing distaste that the Chinese broke food taboos, privately they indulged themselves. Further, it's not just Europeans who broke food taboos to engage with the other. Mark Swislocki, in his work on food consumption in cosmopolitan urban centres of China like Shanghai and Canton, notes that the Chinese consumed Western-style dishes of mutton, which was seen as taboo, especially as most felt that it tasted of perspiration and smelt rancid. And they also dined on beef, which broke societal taboos at that time, as the cow was both a status symbol and seen as a friend and helper of the family that owned it. Now, the Chinese ate these dishes in restaurants created for Western tourists as part of a vogue amongst Chinese dandies for consuming the inedible. In both cultures, the consumption of the inedible proved to be not only a means of othering, but a way of connecting cultures. So within these restaurants, you have commensality at one remove, if you like. Now, Japan, by contrast to China, was seen as modern and clean. And this is a photograph of a tea stall. This kind of encapsulates this idea of old Japan that people are continually trying to connect with, tourists in particular. And that's because after the restoration of the Meiji Emperor in 1868, Japan sought to present itself as a modern country, industrializing and embracing Western ideals and technologies in order to renegotiate unequal treaties with the West. Modernizing meant adopting Western dress and Western food. In January 1872, the emperor announced that he ate beef and mutton, breaking what had been a taboo in Japanese culture. Beef eating in Japan, like China, was taboo because of the status of the cow for families and an increasing embrace of Buddhism with its strictures against taking a life. In the 1870s, beef was consumed by the upper classes, taking on the aspect of a status dish. And as in cosmopolitan urban centers in China, there was a trend of beef consumption among Japanese dandies who sought to approximate Western tastes and styles. And because of this, the selection of Japanese food over Westernized dishes became a choice made out of a desire for a particular experience rather than one dictated by necessity for tourists. In 1885, Annie Russell Coates and her husband Merton chose to dine in a local inn, she wrote, in order to get a thorough insight into the ways and customs of the people. She and her husband dined in their room, kneeling on the floor, where they each had, she said, a tray set beside us on which were placed beautiful lacquered bowls containing soup and vegetables. The flavors of some of the dishes were strange and new to our uninitiated tastes. So food was about encounter, allowing tourists to consume and connect with what they saw as the authentic, unwesternized culture of old Japan. Its strangeness of taste and manners was part of the immersion in a cultural experience that was an essential part of travel. However, engaging with Japanese food, and indeed the Japanese in this way, was not without its own anxieties. Now, Carew Davies Gilbert's Japanese album contains a series of studio photographs contrasting newly westernized Japanese with old Japan. And there's a whole series of these that are produced for the tourist market. I'm focusing on this particular set in his album for this talk, and they're called Dining Abroad and Dining at Home. These are certainly the titles that he gave them. That's his own handwriting. It shows a man in Western dress seated at an opulently appointed table with a waiter who's also a Japanese man in Western dress. But the second image shows the same man at home, stripped to the waist, holding chopsticks, kneeling at his table, waited on by women in a kimono holding a large daikon radish. Now, Luke Gartlin and Eleanor Hyde, in their work on Japanese studio images created for tourists in this period, have read these as a satire on difference. And they are. It's this idea that the Japanese body was unsuited to and uncomfortable in Western settings, dress, and the consumption of Western food. But these images, which are in a tourist's album, can also be read as an expression of anxiety around foreign dining and manners. Whilst the Japanese look uncomfortable taking on the manners of the West, how might the tourists look taking on the manners of the East? A travel, of course, encourages self-reflection, and travellers' accounts, the images and objects that they collect, not only represented the cultures they encountered, they were part of fashioning a presentation of self and hold a mirror to the traveller's own culture. The satire of a Japanese man uncomfortable and unable to properly translate Western dress, manners, and dining habits, when considered in conjunction with travellers' accounts of their own experience negotiating foreign modes and manners, means that these images might also be read as reflective of excursions into unfamiliar and awkward situations outside of their own culture. And Carlyle in 1870 described his experience at the Chinese banquet, not only in terms of what he ate, but also, he said, "We have not implements beyond china spoons and chopsticks. The latter, after some awkward experiments, we can wield with tolerable success before dinner is finished." While Annie Russell Coates wrote of her meal in 1886, not only that it was an immersive experience, but that the little maids who waited on us squatted in a doorway and seemed highly amused at watching us. I'm almost done. This disadvantage marked a reversal of the usual place Western travellers occupied in their own narratives, that of social superior. Dining abroad was, as in the photograph, an awkward experience of imperfectly understood manners, paired with the physicality of foreign dining. These images are an illustration of the potential social exclusion from attempting to adopt or adapt to the culture of the other. So, in conclusion, shared meals were a means of active social engagement, but also, as in the case of Indian experiences, they're a way of maintaining distance used by both tourists and locals. What was eaten not only contributed to a sense of the authentic, but construction of the inedible were used as a means of demonizing locals, as in India in the backlash of the mutiny. But in China, it was not necessarily to demonize. It was deployed by both tourists and local as a means of fostering cultural connection. It's true to a lesser extent of Japan as well, and in both cases, China and particularly Japan, had very different political history with Britain, which were only ever part of informal empire rather than being formally governed in the way that India was. So tourists to Japan sought out social engagements with Japanese culinary culture as a means of accessing old Japan, which was felt to be rapidly disappearing in the face of the government program of westernization. And while they deliberately sought dining with the other as a means of accessing what they felt was an authentic but rapidly disappearing culture, it was also underlaid with anxiety about their own ability to socially engage. So Globetrotter's accounts highlight political sensitivities, but also use the food and commensal dining to present a more nuanced and culturally differentiated experience. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Maybe just one or two questions.
Briefly, apart from this a century later, how do the sort of social profile of people who go on this tour compare with these grand tourists of the 18th century in Europe?
Well,
are they the same social class, and are they different characters in some way because of the different kind of journey?
Well, they actually are the same social class. And what happens is you've got Cook opening up the continent to everyone. And there is this sense in the 19th century that the Grand Tour has become degraded, really, that anyone can go, that the Cockneys from London are out admiring the Colosseum. Because this period, and it's a very brief period, a 50-year period, because Suez opens, because it's easier to get around, you have elites who are then going through the East. And it is the same type of things. It's elite young men. It's perhaps not that very early bit of the Grand Tour where it's really only aristocrats. It's that slightly later incarnation where you do have mercantile elite traveling as well and using it to build up business connections the same way that they did in the latter part of the 18th century in the Grand Tour. But they are elites. There are a lot of young men initially who are moving about together in different groups that constantly change and rearrange themselves depending on who they encounter. And it's how they build up their social networks back in Britain. Now, the reason why I've very specifically identified this as a Grand Tour is because the associations with Grand Tour sites are deliberately invoked as they're traveling through India, China, and Japan. So sites of Delhi are equated with Rome. The Amber Palace is equated with Ehrenbreitstein on the Rhine, which is part of that latter bit of the Grand Tour. Darjeeling is the Alps. Bits of Japan are Venice. And as you move through this, you can see that they only use this Grand Tour terminology because they are traveling around the world. They only use it with India, China, and Japan. They don't invoke it for Australia. They don't invoke it for North America, and they most certainly don't use it for South America. South America, one tourist particularly says South American cities are like second-class Italian cities. So it's an elite for this 50-year period. Now, what it does open up is that you have more women going. But having said that, the Grand Tour of the late 18th century has more women going as well. So it's very comparable in terms of that, even though it's a century later, is that it's an elite who are able to do this, who very deliberately invoke these associations.
The reason why I asked it is because when they're going to Europe, the relationship with those people is different than with Asia because India was a colony at the time. We didn't see the Italians as a colony, so the relationship, the attitude you mentioned about Hindus, you wouldn't have that when you were relating to Italian people, probably, or Greek people. I don't know.
You do get it to a certain extent. So the idea of the East being effeminized, they do refer to the Italians as being slightly effeminate. They talk about Hindus and particularly the Buddhist priests in China. They equate it with Catholicism, and they're very dismissive of Catholicism in Europe. And depending on how it's seen as a threat or not, at different times, they still don't like the idolatry, the incense, the rosary beads, and all of that gets invoked, especially in China. But the idolatry and the incense comes out very clearly in Benares, and they equate it with things like St. Peter's. So they do, again, it is a different relationship, but they are trying to take that idea of the Grand Tour and overlaying it onto the East.
Okay, one very, very short comment, and then we have to move on.
Right. One of my favorite cookery books is Calvin Schwebe's Unmentionable Cuisine, which is full of recipes for most of the exotic ingredients that you mentioned. And what it demonstrates to me is that there is practically nothing which is edible or combination of ingredients which is not at one point or another in history been regarded not only as acceptable but highly desirable. Somewhere on the face of the earth there are probably a race that is extremely fond of raw oysters and chocolate sauce.
No, that is a good one, and that does go into dog eating as well, quite a bit.
Yes.
Yes.
And rats and ants.
Oh, yes. Right, oops. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was really lovely. Okay, and